Hi, my name is Stephanie Douglas, and this is A View from Abroad. And I am trying to enter full screen. There we go. I'm going to give a trigger warning, and the trigger warning is that what I'm going to be talking about today has to do with suicide and suicide prevention. So if you have post-traumatic stress, complex post-traumatic stress, if you've lost someone recently, my hair's sticking out, vein. Um, and I can't tell which side when I'm doing that. It's funny. It's weird. Anyway, um, if you have complex post-traumatic stress, if you've lost someone recently to suicide, if you're feeling vulnerable, if you're feeling fragile, this is going to be talking about suicide and suicide prevention. It just happens to fall on Suicide Awareness Day, but I've been working on this for a few weeks now. I think I put something up on, no, I know I put something up on my Facebook page by the same name, Stephanie Douglas, A View from Abroad, to say that I was working on trying to get some stats. So there's a number of reasons why I'm doing this recording today. One of them is my big sister Lizzy, Elizabeth, um, or Lizzie the Lizard. Um, she committed suicide. She died by suicide on September 12th, 1994. I found out about it on September 13th, 1994. And in that moment of my mother telling me that my oldest sister had committed suicide, that she was dead, um, I don't think, well, I have. I'll never forget the feeling, the wailing, the crying, the disbelief, the not understanding, the it was a horrible experience. And in that moment, I knew that I had lost something precious within myself. I had lost a sense of a piece of my own innocence. I had lost a piece of myself, and I knew, with beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I would never be the same person again. And I haven't been. And that suicide reverberated in my life and my daughter's life um, across the decades, actually. Um, so I've been concerned about suicide on PEI because of the growing homeless situation, the growing population of individuals on who are homeless, the increased poverty, the increased street people, the increased rents, where people who make 12, 13, 14 bucks an hour and have to pay a full month damage deposit and a month rent and move and is insurmountable for a lot of people, even if they're working full time, and especially if they have children. And rents have become so crazily outrageous. Income assistance, the ceiling is still very low. Food, what they give for food is very low, and with the higher housing prices, we also have higher food prices. All these things are part of what is called the root causes of suicide. So, what were the root causes of my sister's suicide? Well, in 1994, that year before, she had lost a couple of friends to AIDS. She had lost a couple of friends to breast cancer. There was the King, if you remember the King riots. Um, there was the riots in LA. They spilled over to Santa Monica. And LA had quite a big earthquake around that time, 1994. And compounding all of it, my sister's, not her dog, her neighbor's dog, who she had loved for many, many, many years, she had lived next to, died. And the crowning glory of everything is that I didn't know this till after my sister's death, but she had been on lithium for quite a long time, which I guess had worked really well. My sister was an amazingly intelligent woman. Um, when we first moved to Spain, she was 15, and at 15, she kind of said goodbye to my dysfunctional mother and took off with her passport. And oh, I see a cat going through. Um, and that's Kaylee. She's a lovely cat. She's a companion healing cat. She's a magic cat. Anyway, she traveled all over the Mid East. She went to Turkey and Israel. She was on a kibbutz for almost 18 months, 17 months, 16 or 17 months, because at 18 months, if you were in Israel and you're Jewish and on a kibbutz, you had to sign up for the army. Um, she was in Jordan. She was all over the place. And she had a lot of issues, and she got sick, and she had a hard time. But she went to university. She did a degree in cultural anthropology, I believe it was. And then she, or maybe it was, anyway, it was in anthropology. And then she became a researcher for UCLA. That's where she took her degree. And not a library, like a researcher. She was a researcher librarian, so not the one who checks out books. She had been working there for 20 years. So she was quite stable. However, that was also the year that, during that time where Prozac hit the market. And if I had had more financial ability, or if I had been in the States, I would have joined the class action lawsuit against Prozac, because a lot of doctors did what her doctor did. She had been on lithium for many years and was quite stable and working full time. She had a life, she had a job, she had friends, and the doctor changed her to Prozac, um, and she committed suicide. So it was a combination of all the tragedies she had had in her life over a year, the change in medication, and not. So there's a grief process with each death, and with so many deaths so close together, and then the riots, and then the earthquake, her friend, the dog dying, the change of medication, um, all of those came together, and she lost sight of hope and fell into complete despair. At the time that she committed suicide, I was working in mental health in the downtown Vancouver core, and my sister knew about the work I did and all of that. So I was not the one she called. I was not the one she told about her plan. She told my younger sister, who was in Zurich. She actually went to Zurich, told my sister that she was going to commit suicide, that she had all her paperwork in place. My sister, of course, lives in a world of denial, and has for all her life on many issues. And instead of telling the rest of the family, she didn't tell anybody because she didn't want to believe it. And so the reason why Lizzie did not tell me is she knew that I would do whatever I had to do to get down to Santa Monica where she lived, and to try and give her support and talk her out of it, and find resources and just be there for her. Um, which is why she didn't tell me, because she knew that's what I would do. Very determined woman. When she set her mind to something, she accomplished it. Unfortunately, she accomplished her own death very thoroughly. So she never missed work. Um, she never did not call in sick if she was sick, and so she only missed work for she didn't show up to work, and that in itself was such an anomaly that people were worried. Sent the police to her house, and they found her. So my sister Lizzie had lived in a lot of dangerous places, had traveled in the Middle East when, because she was white, she was Irish, my mother's first husband. So she was white with long brown hair, and at that time, a lot of white slavers were in the Middle East, and young women traveling through the Middle East would just go missing, mostly blondes. But anyway, but not exclusively, of course. If they were white, they were valuable. It's something that we don't talk about anymore. The white slave trade in the Middle East that used to take place. I don't know if it still does. She lived in Santa Monica, so she was used to LA, used to, gun violence, understood it, knew it, never owned a gun in her life. She bought a gun. She went to the driving range and learned how to use this gun. And she held a pillow to her head and shot herself through the pillow to muffle the sound. Lizzie was always very thorough. So, it's been a long time since her suicide. But I've met people whose family members have committed suicide 40, 50 years ago, and it still affects them. For me, there's good years and bad years. This year is a hard year simply because there's so much else going on in the city that has me worried about people's lives, and the fact that PI is very, 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 very behind in terms of acknowledging suicide, talking about it. The media is not trained, it doesn't understand how to write stories on suicide, not the sensational stories, but the everyday stories. The coroner's office has been incredibly unhelpful because I've asked for suicide stats. They said they don't collect them. I went, "Are you serious? Are you serious? You don't collect them for people who are homeless or on the streets?" They said, "How would we know?" I'm going, "Well, the police would tell you." I mean, like, if they died on the street and if they died homeless, then that's a stat, and it's something that we should know on PEI so that we can be aware of what's going on. The Charlottetown police have been horrifically rude. As a journalist in Washington State, even West Prince, back then while was dealing with RCMP, but Washington State, Sunshine Coast, Rocky Mountain House, Alberta. I have never had the police just completely ignore 3 phone calls asking for the media spokesperson to get back to me and why I wanted them to get back to me and why it was important, and having nobody even give me a call back. I talked to the chief of police administrative assistant and asked her the last time. Like, I've been doing this for 3 weeks. I've given them 3 weeks to get back to me about suicide stats on if there's an increase, or if they're seeing an increase in suicide stats among the new homeless, and individuals who are homeless, families who are homeless, and people living on the streets, or people on income assistance who are desperate because they can't find housing for them and their kids, and they're stuck. They're terrified. Their kids will be taken away. Anyway, nobody's gotten back to me, which is unfortunate. So it's up to everybody out there, especially if you own property, you own a business, to call your local police station and to call your coroner's office and go, who's collecting the stats? Why are they not being disclosed to journalists so that the community can know what's going on? And how can you be so rude? Like, you didn't even call to say, they didn't even call to say, we're not going to give you the information. They just ignored me completely. No callbacks. Even if they had called to say, well, we're calling you back to tell you that we're not going to give you anything, I would have said, okay, at least they called me back. But not even that. So that kind of silence on suicide is what causes suicide. It's a tough one. You know, there's when a family member commits suicide. Well, my sister lived in LA and I was in Vancouver. Um, I hadn't seen her very often because she had always chosen to go and live in the States. And when my stepfather, or my mother's last husband, decided to move to Vancouver Island, I didn't have much of a choice, and ended up in Canada. And I wasn't one to want to go down to LA. It didn't draw me. Um, my one of my younger sisters did. So my brother lived in the States. My eldest sister lived in the States, and the sister just a couple of years younger than me lived in the States. And my youngest sister, she went to Australia. She's cut off all the family. It's a dysfunctional family. So why talk about suicide? Because if we don't talk about it, and we don't talk about it with each other, and we don't allow others to talk about suicide, that actually pushes people to suicide. It's an uncomfortable conversation. When someone's feeling suicidal and they're talking about not wanting to live, wanting to end their life, not seeing the purpose of life, not seeing why bother if it's always such a struggle and there's so little joy and so much hardship, it's hard to hear. But what people forget is that if someone is talking about this, it's because they are looking for ways not to commit suicide. When people have nobody to talk to and are isolated, whether from community, from family, from friends, because they're sick, because there's multiple issues going on, um, because there's poverty, because there's child abuse in their background, alcoholism, addictions, all these things are components of the root causes of suicide. Suicide is never the first option for people. It is almost invariably the absolute last option when they are so filled with despair that they can't see any way out. There is no hope. There's no hope. Suicide is a loss of hope and the utter darkness of despair. How do I know this? Well, from working with people who are suicidal, from having my own sister commit suicide, from having one of my best friends at the time, his brother committed suicide 4 years after my sister. And because when I was worked as a journalist in Rocky Mountain House, I was hired by the editor and part owner, Brian Mazza. He was in Rocky Mountain House, Alberta. I was in Vancouver. And he hired me because of my experience in mental health. Because they had so many suicides in the community, both with the indigenous people on the reserves, as well as in the non-indigenous community. Children as young as 9 had killed themselves, and seniors as old as 75 had killed themselves, and everything in between. Because regardless There are some communities that have higher rates of suicide because of the poverty, the lack of fresh water, the lack of work, the lack of appropriate housing. All those things are root causes of suicide. However, across the country, suicide is an equal opportunity killer. Doesn't matter how much money you have, how much power you have, what position you have, how much family you have or don't have. Um, Suicide crosses all economic, social, educational, age, and gender boundaries. That's what people don't realize. And part of that is because the media usually does sensational stories rather than the everyday stories about suicide. And on PI is very, very, very backwards in that. They can have all the Bell Let's Talk, which is a scam. I'm not going to deal with that today. And they can have Suicide Awareness Day, all they want. But unless the police are talking to the media, and unless the media is intelligent enough and compassionate enough and cares enough about community, they're not going to do the stories that mean something and can save lives. And I don't have faith that the print media and PI has that ability. Not at this point in time. Um, so in Rocky Mountain House, when I lived in Rocky Mountain House, it was a unique time for me, a unique time for the RCMP detachment. Because the RCMP detachment took the lead, Staff Sergeant took the lead ongoing. We have had so many suicides both in the indigenous communities on reserve and in town and throughout the county. Clearwater County is huge. It goes from, I think, just before Caroline all the way to the Banff Park boundary. The town of Rocky has 6,000 people. The whole county, I think it had around 30,000 maybe. There had been so many suicides in such a short space of time that the RCMP took the lead. They took the lead, which is what Charlottetown police should be doing, is taking the lead, not offering silence. And they got community members together, the mayor together, um, members of city council, chiefs of the different tribes, of the two different reserves, and different nations, um, Cree and Stolo, if I remember correctly, um, seniors groups, youth groups, and they hired a facilitator. And one of the things that was unprecedented as well was that there was roundtables held in Rocky Mountain House, in the town of Rocky Mountain House, and people from both the Sunchild and Ochese reserves were coming into town to attend these, and we rotated the roundtables rotated, so they were held on Ochese Reserve and Sunchild Reserve, and people from Rocky Mountain House, some of them who had never been on either reserve, were going out there to participate. So all the communities were participating together. Um, as a journalist, I followed all the stories. I participated in every single roundtable. I did stories. I did stories on the roundtables on people's stories of loss and of abuse and of family violence. One of the things that the RCMP detachment did was to change, to actually create a new model for how they collected stats. So they had suicides, death by suicide, and attempted deaths by suicides, and threats of death by suicide. And then they would put in the situation, um, the strat ones especially usually happened when a lot of people who had been abused or had been molested or raped or um, really dysfunctional families, alcoholism, all sorts of different things. And they collected stats on what the state of that person was when they threatened to kill themselves. They had how people had killed themselves and all the stats in between. One of the things that did come out during the roundtables in the farming, so the area that I was in the foothills of central Alberta, two things were very prominent as industries: farming and oil fields. And what came out of those roundtable discussions, those discussions, which I had so much admiration for the men who came forward to talk about this, and to talk about how it affected them, and to talk about the friends they had lost. Work injuries for men in farming and in oil field industry, where they'd been working in those jobs for decades, when they had a work injury, it took a piece of who they was because they could no longer work. They felt less than they used to because they couldn't provide for their family. Their sense of identity was often tied up with their jobs, so they lost their sense of identity. And suicide among those groups was quite high. Also, the RCMP were awesome, at least at that time in that place in 2006. That year and a half I was there, it was an amazing group of people at the detachment, incredible sergeants and staff sergeants, incredible commanding officers, incredible RCMP officers. Um, they all participated in one way or another. And this staff sergeant, Alex, he spoke openly about the issues of police law enforcement officers having a high rate of suicide and why, and how could they stop that silence among the, like, we're so, we have to keep it all together and silence, because it wasn't helping anybody by not talking about it. So yeah, suicide has been, I've experienced it through the loss of family. I've worked with people who have been suicidal, and as a journalist, I covered extensively a community and the suicides of young and old, and a community's fight to change that. Um, and everybody had to participate in that to make those changes so that the suicide stats fell. Um, but we're not doing that here on PI. And having a day called Suicide Awareness Day is like, I don't know, it's like having Peach Awareness Day. Unless we are taught and teach each other how to talk about suicide and how to approach people and how to allow others to talk about suicide, we're not going to change anything. A lot of people get really, really uncomfortable when a friend or a family member talks about feeling suicidal. So there's one or two responses like, don't talk like that, that's so horrible, you make me feel terrible, you make me feel guilty. The last thing that somebody who's feeling suicidal needs is like more guilt. Um, one more thing heaped on their heads. You're so selfish. How could you even think of such a thing with family and friends or children? Um, all that guilt on someone who is already in such deep, dark despair and in a place of absolute hopelessness. Despair and hopelessness. That kind of response actually is a really good way to push people over the edge into suicide. So, how do you talk to someone about suicide? Well, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you just, if you know the person well and you know they're not doing well, it's making sure that you're checking in with them every day or every couple of days, taking them out for lunch, taking them out for ice cream, um, having them over for family dinners. And sometimes it definitely is going, I notice that you don't seem okay right now. What's going on? Do you want to talk about it? Are you feeling suicidal? I know it's been hard. Money's been tight. You haven't been able to find a place to live. You're worried about the kids being taken. Your job is stressful. Um, is this something, is suicidal ideation something in your head? And if it is, then let them talk about it. And just go, I can listen. And also be very clear with yourself on what your limits are. What can you give to the other person that you're capable and have the capacity to give? Some people don't have the capacity to listen to that kind of those kind of feelings. Some people have the capacity and the money to buy that person groceries, take them out and buy them a new shirt, take them to the theater, take them for a drive to the beach, take them out for coffee, take them out for lunch, um, help them see laughter, help them see joy, help them experience beauty. Those things help amazingly. So talking about suicide isn't always like, tell me that you feel suicidal. Sometimes it's knowing the other person is doing really poorly and going, how can I support you? This is what I can do. Because it's important for the person who's offering support and help to be very clear about their limits and their boundaries and limits, and what their own capacity is, and what their own capabilities are, and what their own knowledge is. And those of us who have experienced our friends or family members who have died by suicide or have felt suicidal ourselves are fully aware that not everybody can be there in every way for us. And nobody should be there in every way for us. It's how does the community come around to support each other and to support us where, when we're in that state of mind, when we're so broken by poverty, by working with government, by dealing with government organizations that have no concept of the reality of people's lives, um, rents that are increasing, food prices that means that people eat very bad food, and in doing so, it hinders and or destroys their mental health. Because one of the first things of good mental health is healthy food. Not processed food, not processed sugars, but a good balance of meat, vegetables, protein, like meat or protein, vegetables, fish, fruit, cheese, nuts, like the good stuff. Not even the most expensive stuff. We're talking about cabbage. Cabbage is expensive. Cauliflower, broccoli, spinach, romaine lettuce, all those things, green beans, all those things are really, really expensive. Squash, bananas, like basic foods. But people who have mental health issues or depression or anxiety, or post-traumatic stress, or have chronic illness, arthritis, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, eating bad food, putting that processed junk into our bodies makes us depressed. It has a lot of sugar and it has a lot of other stuff that isn't good for us, for anybody. Like, period. It's not good for anybody. But what it does is when you eat foods that are heavy on the preservatives and sugars and sodium, especially the sugars, is it makes you high and then it makes you crash. And that crash, when you're already crashed, is deadly. And that's not overstating it. It's deadly. So, talking about suicide and having a community that is willing to acknowledge that right now on PI, we have increased root causes of suicide. We have poverty that has grown because income assistance has not kept up with the cost of living or the cost of housing. The city has purposely, intentionally created a housing crisis. They have chosen not to put in any strategies, even though they've been a part of um, research for over 6 years. We're a part of research and recommendations to avert, increase um, homelessness. The city has chosen not to do anything with that. The city has chosen not to put in any bylaws to ensure that new construction and new buildings have affordable housing. Um, Food, because housing has gone up, food has gone up, and yet what income assistance gives or the wages people make are still really low. And if you're a single parent or you're a single income earner in a minimum wage job, and you don't have family and you don't have supports and you don't have connections and you're alone, those are all great and very, very, very significant root causes of suicide. Add on top of that family violence, sexual abuse, physical abuse, childhood abuse, bullying by other staff or workers or family members. Um, all of those things contribute. They're all considered root causes of suicide. Suicide is the last resort that anybody turns to. It is not the first thing a person thinks of. Oh, I'm having a bad day. I think I'll commit suicide. Or, oh God, it's been a really crappy week. I'm going to commit suicide. No, that's not how it goes. It is a long stretch of despair and hopelessness and lack of supports and lack of community, estrangement from family, isolation. It all adds up to a point where you can't see any light. There's no light. There's no hope. Hope is what keeps us going. Even in the worst times, hope. And when you lose all hope, all there is despair. And when all there is that pit of dark despair, there are no reasons to keep on living. None. The pain is so intense. It goes to the very, very root of your soul that you can't see any way out of it. It's a endless spiral into hopelessness and despair. And it's hard to even see any lifeline, especially when nobody is throwing any lifelines. So, if you know people who are having a hard time, if you live in an apartment building and you know somebody is having a hard time, if you live in a neighborhood and you see the same neighbor day in and day out, and all of a sudden they look distressed and tired and weak, and go over and say hi and say, look, I see you all the time. How are you doing? I notice that you don't seem to be doing great. Are you okay? Do you need help? And always be clear with yourself. what your own capacity is to help. What are you capable of, and what is your capacity? Because it doesn't do anybody any good if you don't have the capacity or the capability to do more than say, um, to ask them, to say, look, you seem really, really down. Are you okay? Are you feeling suicidal? And if they say yes, then go, there are resources, there are supports, there's emergency helplines, you know, you should contact them. And would you like to go for coffee? I have a few extra minutes. If there's someone you know better, then talk to them. Let them talk about it. Sometimes talking about suicide, sometimes you're not in that place of despair where you're going to kill yourself and it's imminent. But sometimes life gets really, really tough and you want to have a back door. And our minds need a back door. And so when people are talking about suicide, they're not killing themselves. Because people who are intent are dying by suicide, by killing themselves by suicide, they don't talk. They just plan and execute it. So if someone's talking about it, great. You want them to talk about it. Don't shut them down and don't guilt them out. Don't say, oh, you selfish bastard, or you selfish bitch, or you selfish child, or your life isn't as tough as it could be. It could be way, way worse. Pull yourself up and get your shit together. And any of that stuff, those are pushes onto the ledge. And as you get more of those pushes, going over the ledge seems more and more appealing. So if you can't keep condemnation and guilt and anger and what's the word I'm looking for? Guilt, anger, disappointment. If you can't keep that out of your voice, just shut up. Just don't say anything. Because saying those things, adding guilt, disrespect, misunderstanding, heaping scorn on someone who is already as low as they can possibly go and still be alive, is just pushing them to the edge. However, if you have compassion and you're kind and your intent is decent, any of us, anybody, regardless of what's going on, we always hear the genuine care that people give. And even if they're a stranger, even if you don't know them well, I've done it to people who have made a comment and I've picked up the despair in their voice and I've just blatantly said, are you feeling suicidal? And I've had, yes, I am. And there's not much I can do for that particular person. But in that moment, I can hold them and hug them. I ask, can I hug you? I've had young women put their arms around me and fold themselves into me and just hang on for a really long hug. And sometimes that's all we need, is that physical contact and the assurance that somebody cares whether we live or die, even if they're a stranger. It doesn't do us any good to have one day a year where we call Suicide Awareness Day. We need suicide awareness every day because it happens every day, whether they're small children or they're seniors. And in order for the community to have a really good sense of what's going on and why, it's up to all of us, you and I, to be very aware of the conditions in our community, the housing issues. If we own property, are we a part of that? Are we going, I could fill my pockets. Because the reality is just because we can do something, sometimes we need to ethically ask ourselves, I can do this. It's legal, I can do it. Should I do it? I can jack my rents up by 500%. Should I do it? Who do I harm? Who may end up dead? Because greed. You know? Find out, like really, really find out about what income assistance rates are and what they give for housing and for food and for clothing. It's your right, part of the community, to know this and to look at the budget and go, 95% of the budget actually goes to salaries and staff and RSPs, and only like 5 to 10% are going to people and families. How many people are going hungry at night? How many kids? And how many kids are going into foster care because their parents can't pay for the rent, the food, and laundry and cleaning supplies? So the kids are going to school dirty, and everybody goes, "Oh my God, the kids are dirty." However, what the parent is doing is choosing to feed their child rather than doing laundry and buying cleaning supplies, which are expensive, even at the dollar store. The dollar store is no longer a dollar store; it's a dollars store. Suicide awareness and suicide prevention belongs to every single one of us in a community. We are all responsible for each other. Knowing what the root causes are. I mean, we have technology at the tip of our fingers like we never had before. Sending an email to your um, to the Charlottetown police and going, what kind of stats are you keeping, and how come you're not talking to someone who really wants a stat so that we can have an idea of what's going on? Talking or emailing or sending letters to the media, especially print media, and going, why aren't you doing stories about suicide and not just the sensational ones? Why aren't you doing stories about the root causes? Why aren't you giving me facts and figures about, has suicide increased on PI since the homelessness has increased, individuals who are homeless, new homeless? Because the people who are the most vulnerable don't have a voice. I mean, they do. They do have a voice. They don't know that they can use it. And a lot of times they're afraid to use it. Or they don't have the skill to um, access the people to have their voice heard. So it's up to those of us who have a voice, who know how to use it, who are not afraid of the repercussions, who have the power and have the ability. It's our job. My mother always said, if you see it, do something about it. Because don't assume everybody else will. So if we want to save children from suicide because they're being bullied, if we want to save that senior from suicide because they're in their 70s or 80s and they're barely eating because they don't have enough money, if it's a young person who's homeless because they don't have any supports and their family is dysfunctional and they've left an abusive alcoholic or whatever situation, if it's a woman who's been raped and hasn't had enough support from family or community, if it's someone who's had extensive trauma over their lifetime and has reached a point where they just can't take another one. It does not take a community to raise a child. It takes a community to raise an individual. And it takes a community to raise families. And it takes community to raise families, to raise children. We are all responsible for each other. So, Please think about this. Share your own stories of what has worked if you've felt suicidal and someone's reached out to you. What has made an impression? How you've helped someone else, how you've been there, or um, comments or questions about what's going on in PI in the city and why are the root causes of suicide growing. Even though we have so much information on determinants of health and risks to health. Thank you for being here today. I hope you're here a lot more often, and I hope that you take something away from this that's positive, that helps you go out and keep an eye on your friends and keep an eye on your neighbors and ask the difficult questions and really know your own boundaries and limits and what your capacity is to help. This is Stephanie Douglas, A View from Abroad, September 10th, 2018.